Hey folks, welcome back to the latest edition of the Most Awesome Founder podcast. Today I am once again with my colleague and good friend, Professor Dries Faems. We have these great opportunities to switch roles as hosts, and I just found out today that I'm the host, so I guess I'm leading this intro. But I really love doing these sessions. Today we're doing another one of Dries and I's inspiration sessions where we talk about things that made us learn, made us think, and made us laugh, tapping into current events, current research, and interesting stories about technology, entrepreneurship, and all of the interesting topics that we love to cover on this podcast. Dries, I have to start by saying I had a hard time picking topics today because I feel like the past few weeks there's just so much crazy shit going on in the world. I was reading like Elon Musk's tweet yesterday. I don't know if you saw that about the migrants. So
the one in Germany.
He was tweeting to the German public about these NGOs and the migrant ships, and the German Foreign Office was like, yeah, it's called Saving Lives, buddy. And I was like, oh, that's a good one. And then I just kind of got going down a rabbit hole, and I'm like, man, there's so many things to talk about right now. And it just reminded me that I think this is such a fun conversation for me because one, I enjoy our engagement and the different perspectives we look at the same topics, but I also think we're just in a crazy fucking time. Like there's just so much stuff happening of, whether it's the way funding is changing with startups or the nutty technologies or the political economic issues surrounding them. I think we could do these every day and have something different and ridiculous to talk about. But that being said, shall we just kick it off?
Yes.
Rather than wandering, why don't we start in usual fashion, Dries, and you start by talking about something that made you learn.
Yes, but actually your introduction is interesting because I think the two items that I brought with me today are actually topics that I think are not getting a lot of attention nowadays, whereas I think they're quite important. And that's actually why I wanted to kind of highlight them, because for me, these are two topics that don't receive a lot of attention. And the first one that I want to discuss is about the issue of entrepreneurs seeking public funding. So as an entrepreneur, you can, of course, go, like you were saying, you can go for investors, and that landscape is also fundamentally changing. There is a lot of discussion about what is the future of VC. But an alternative is that you actually check out whether you can get funding from public institutions like local governments, national governments, maybe even the European Union. All these institutions actually nowadays have quite a broad portfolio of kind of subsidy instruments where you as a startup can get support for your activities. Now, before I go into the paper that I want to discuss, maybe a question for you, because you have created quite some startups in the past and in the present. Have you actually ever tried to get funding from a government agency? Have you gone kind of that rabbit hole?
Dries, you're talking to an American, man. We don't get that kind of crap where I come from. We are a totally, I feel like, private sector driven world. I mean, all jokes aside, there are some funding opportunities out there, of course. But I would say the ubiquity and the access to it, I wasn't really exposed to until I came to Germany. When I lived in Canada, it really hadn't, I think the government really hadn't caught up with the startup world yet. So when I was there, I left in 2009. It hadn't really kicked off yet. Now it's definitely there, and most Canadian ventures I know are tapping into funds like that. In the US, interestingly enough, it tends to be bigger dollar amounts, bigger types of projects. Big research funding. There's the Small Business Administration that does big kind of technical grants and whatnot. But seeing the funding accessible in smaller amounts, supporting founders, rather than supporting innovation topics, but actually supporting the entrepreneurs themselves. That's something very, very new to me that seems for me at least as an American, a pretty uniquely European experience. So that's a long answer to saying no, never gotten a buck from the government, just bills for taxes.
Yeah, but of course you're already quite some years now in Germany, in Europe, but so you have never had kind of the intention to start looking into that kind of ways to, because there are quite some interesting funding schemes also in Germany. Yeah, you have the Exist scheme, and you have all these schemes where actually founders then kind of get a salary of the government for the first year or the first 2 years when they have their startup. So that's kind of the opportunity costs are a bit lower.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a two-part answer to that question. The first part is, just last week I finally got my German citizenship.
Oh,
that application.
So we should celebrate this with a kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, Germany just got a little bit shadier. But that process took 2 years of bureaucracy and a lot of paperwork, and that was pretty frustrating to say the least. The other part is, I worked in the kind of nonprofit world. I worked for the UN and bilateral unilateral aid agencies for almost a decade before I got into tech, and I certainly was exposed to plenty of grant writing. And that process is notoriously long, painful, tedious, and didn't always come with the return that you hope for. So, I mean, I spent times where I spent a month or two writing a grant myself or paying a grant writer a lot of money, and it didn't actually pan out. And I think for me, when I've thought about this process since I've been here, and I kind of looked at the odds, and I say, how many investors could I talk to in the period of time that I'm trying to write this grant? And of course, networks matter, relationships matter. So it was never really appealing to me. I do want to caveat that and say, if I was a deep tech founder in the R&D process, and I knew I had a long runway before I could actually commercialize and get to market, I think you almost don't have a choice to go after that type of funding. But if you're quickly commercializable type venture, I'm not sure the value proposition is as compelling as, free money out there, because all money has a price, right?
Okay, and I think that's a very good introduction to the paper that I want to briefly discuss. So the paper is called Subsidy Entrepreneurs, an Inquiry into Firms Seeking Public Grants. It was published in the Journal of Industry, Competition and Trade in 2020 by 3 authors named Anders Gustafsson, Patrick Gustafsson, and Daniel Halvarsson, which I think makes clear from which country they are coming. So we are talking here about 3 scholars from Sweden that were able to collect very interesting data about Swedish startups and the extent to which they apply for funding. And actually, the purpose of this research was to find out who is actually getting funding, which kind of startups are getting funding, and are it actually the more successful firms that are getting funding, or is it the least successful firms that are getting funding? So that's what they wanted to find out. So are it the high flyers or the low flyers that are getting funding? Any intuition? What do you think?
I mean, it's just an intuition, but if I would think historically, I would say these aren't the high flyers, right? One, just because my hypothesis would be they have a longer trajectory to get to market, which creates a greater opportunity for failure. And generally speaking, really experienced entrepreneurs with a track record of success and whatnot would find capital quite freely in other places. I guess that would be my guess. But that being said, I'm not Swedish, so maybe in Sweden there's a different model going on.
No, I think in the end, your intuition seems to quite align well with the findings. So what do these scholars do? Of course, always have to, as a scholar, you have to measure success in one way or another, and that's always difficult. But so here they look at labor productivity as a success factor. And so labor productivity is even kind of an accounting number that you can kind of calculate based on the annual results of companies, where you actually calculate how much added value is one employee creating for your company. So that's the success factor they were able to kind of identify for all these companies. And so what they in the end did was looking at do companies with a high labor productivity, do they apply more or less for grants, and who is actually getting grants? And so what they found was that kind of the top companies, so the most successful ones, they don't apply at all. Yeah, so they just don't care about this kind of funding. Then kind of the moderately successful firms, they allocate some of their time, so they typically apply for some funding. And then the least productive firms, they heavily apply for funding. So there they see that these kind of firms on a very regular basis apply for funding. And because they do it in a very regular way, they're also more likely to get it. Of course, if you don't apply for it, you can never get it. But so actually they see that the companies that apply the most, which tend to be the least productive companies, always also are more likely to get funding in the end. And so in the end, what they conclude is that this kind of subsidies, this kind of public funding is mainly distributed to the least productive startups in the population.
What do you think of that measure of productivity? Because that's the thing that's sticking in my head on this one.
Yeah, that's of course always a question like, how do you measure success? And you could, as an alternative, go more like, are you VC backed or something like that? But then the problem always becomes that you're suddenly talking about a very small part of your economy, because actually not that many startups or SMEs are VC ready or even interesting for VC. So that's always a bit the tension that you also see in research. Do we focus on this very narrow, specific group of VC-backed startups that already get a lot of attention, or do we go for a broader sample? But if you go for a broader sample, typically your choices in terms of how do we measure success become a bit more restrictive. So I think here they clearly wanted to go for the broader sample, but that also means that, yeah, your success indicators become a bit more questionable, I would say.
So this value added per employee metric, that's based on is it based on the actual revenue of the company? Sorry, I might have missed. Okay, got it.
So it's simply people report their costs, their revenues, and based on that, you can calculate in really a kind of accounting way this value added per employee, which is a kind of standard metric that in financial accounting can be applied.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think that, you know, this is still going to be such a narrow selection of startups, right? Like me being here in Berlin and seeing as many startups as I do on a regular basis, how few would kind of fit into these categories, you know? I mean, because maybe you take the Gründerstipendium type financing out of this equation, right?
Yeah.
This is probably more R&D type, maybe larger scale funding to solve bigger issues. And I think, wow, there'd be so few in this ecosystem. Yet if I think of my teams that I work with in Silicon Valley through Alchemist Accelerator, there would be probably a huge number of them. And but they're just profoundly different ventures. And even though I think we're moving in an era of deep tech, there's still so much just kind of more traditional commercial venturing taking place out there. So this is, to me, a bit of a subsection of, you know, the sample size is maybe a bit more specific than you described. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
No, I don't know. But actually, I think if I remember well, they had like 2,000 companies. So it's not extremely small, but at the same time, you can still say it's a kind of a selection from the economy. So in that way, that makes sense. Yeah.
But there's an inherent, the selection criteria, because they're being selected based on if they're getting these grants, right?
So here they simply look at who is applying. So they have
who is applying.
So they have the full population and they are looking at who is applying. And so they see that the least productive are applying more. And then they also tested from the ones who apply, who does really get the funding. And then you see again that the least productive kind of outperform simply because they apply more.
It's interesting because, when I was leading the Entrepreneurship Center at WHU, we were helping to facilitate some exist grants.
Yeah.
And I mean, we had a lot of people inquiring about them, but as soon as they read the criteria for the grant, right, and the kind of technological innovation, most people chose not to put in the effort to apply because they didn't feel that they qualified. It was generally the more science-based or like emerging technology-based companies that applied for it. So if you were building an e-commerce company, you probably wouldn't put the energy into making that application. But interesting.
No, but so for me, it of course also triggers then the broader question: should we do this? So if we see that actually we are not really supporting the most productive firms, but the least productive, should we do it? And I think you can think in two ways. You can think like, if we are mainly kind of supporting the bottom, maybe it's not a good thing. At the same time, you could also argue, but you can think in terms of kind of inequality, and it can actually kind of give people that have maybe a more difficult kind of starting position still the room to, even if they're not productive in the short term, maybe but these grants help them to become more successful in the long term. So I don't have maybe that's because I'm a scholar. Maybe my opinion is here a bit gray. But you see, of course, that there is often a lot of discussion about this kind of grants. And I think this actually definitely contributes to thinking about, okay, who are we actually supporting? And is this something that we want? So I think we need to be honest about it. So it seems that we are mainly supporting the weaker players in the ecosystem. And then I think it's a matter almost of ideology, whether you want it or not.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, VCs are also supporting the weak players in the ecosystem, right? Because only 20% of those companies actually are successful, right? So the super majority of private investment into new ventures is a sunk lost cost anyways, right? So in the end, it's just by the statistics that only the top percent of companies are going to succeed and the super majority are going to fail. So, I think when you think of these policies, you have to think, this is, to me, the challenge is policymakers are often out of touch with reality. So maybe they create expectations and targets that aren't feasibly reachable. I would be looking at any kind of grant funding the same way I would look at venture funding, that, you got to think that 80% of the money that goes into it is going to be written off, and only the top piece, the upper echelon is going to achieve the success that's going to kind of cover the value of the total investment, right? And I think
I want to give you some pushback, because
cool.
I think VC for me is a very specific kind of universe where you want to invest in the crazy ones. It's like, I build a portfolio of 10 companies and I accept that 8 will never become successful, but I want to have these 2 or this 1 shots where they really create my return on investment. But it's almost like you invest in companies that others don't want to invest in because they think it's too crazy, but you see this kind of diamond in the rough and you believe that at least some of them can make it. And that's why we need venture capital to kind of invest in this crazy outliers. Whereas I think maybe the public funding is more about, okay, we just want to kind of, and it's not only about these crazy outliers, we just also want to have reasonable companies that can help the country in having sufficient employment. So for me, maybe the objective of this kind of funding is different from VC funding, and they are perfectly capable to exist next to each other. But then, because they are a different kind of funding, they should also apply different criteria.
I think I'm going to push back on your pushback a little bit. Because I think what you're talking about is, venture capital strategy, and that only occurs in a subsection of venture capital. Because I would say, angel investors, for example, aren't betting only on unicorns. Private equity has a different IRR model altogether that is not looking for that either. And some could argue, a deep tech funding source is actually, they're the ones that are really gambling on the outliers because they have such uncertainty with their R&D. They're not even commercialization ready. They're the highest risk ones of all.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think in reality, like, most ventures are going to fail.
Yeah.
That's just the reality of it. This is just another alternative financial product, right? That's servicing a different client base. And the reality is I think we need diversity in that, right? We don't want to put all the horsepower into VC.
No.
I think government, and then there's secondary benefits, which we'll actually touch in one of the topics I'm talking about later, which, like, government should have its finger on the pulse of innovation. And this is a mechanism that allows them to at least be engaged in a certain degree, because as we see in Germany, as we see in other countries in the world as well, there's such a detachment between policymakers and what's actually happening on the ground, that there's this massive delay between, like, dealing with regulation and enablement from what technology is doing. So I think, we don't want government dictating how the private sector and innovation happens, but we certainly want them at the table. And if they're going to be at the table, they shouldn't, regulate their asses to the table. They should buy their way in like everybody else and participate in an equitable way. And to me, this is a way to do it. Now, politics aside, some people may believe in small government. Some people may believe in lower taxes. That's, their prerogative. But this does, I think, build a stronger connection between the largest funding sources on the planet, which are our governments, and the innovation that's happening on the ground. So I wholeheartedly support it. We just have to expect that the returns are not going to be hugely ambitious. But then again, where are they in any kind of government funding initiative?
No, makes sense, actually. Yeah.
Cool. Good topic.
No, it's something we rarely discuss, I think, and still I think it's a very important part. Like, what is the role of government in this kind of industry, and how can we shape that role to maximize its added value?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly really, really interesting to think of the role of government, right? Because I think we also think of this from a very Western lens, right? And even me, like, I think the Americans are kind of on one far end, and the Europeans are maybe a bit more centrist on this topic. But when you think on the other end of the spectrum too, you look at, like, China, for example, who are playing a key role in this stuff, that maybe the driving role in this stuff. And there are certain, subsectors of technology and innovation where that country is dominating because of the horsepower the government's putting into it. And I think this opens up some really interesting, political topics. But I'm going to save that for later. So I want to talk about a topic that it's actually been in the back of my mind for a long time, and it just kind of resurfaced and led me to read a book over the past couple of weeks. But, over the past month or two, I've been kind of reflecting on my entrepreneurial journey, because it's been really, next year, it'll be like 20 years of building companies. And there's one that I think about a lot, which is my first venture-backed company, Kula.com. This was an enterprise SaaS, but it was also a social venture. And, we kind of came into that business with this very audacious goal of, we want to contribute $1 billion a year to philanthropy, but coming from corporates, which are grossly underrepresented when it comes to philanthropy. Like in the US, for example, corporate philanthropic dollars account for less than 20% of the total. Okay. So most philanthropic giving is coming from individuals. And of course, we didn't meet that audacious goal, but we did have a pretty nice impact. The billions was millions, at least. But last week, I was talking with one of my portfolio founders, a company that I have a little bit of equity in Silicon Valley. It's also a social enterprise called GiveShop. And we were talking about why there are so few unicorn social ventures. And, I think, of course, you could debate all day what you consider a social venture to be. But I think in the kind of traditional definition where, it's baked into the DNA of the company to put, people and planet above profit, or to the core mission of its business model is to contribute to social good. There are not so many that have, reached the kind of scale that would make a VC drool. We could actually only think of one. There's a U.S. company called Benevity, which is kind of a giving platform for corporates, for employee branding, employee engagement that kind of reached unicorn status. So I wanted to understand why. Why is it, because there can be scalable business models in this space, but where's the missing link? And, it was interesting because before I was building technology companies, I was working as a development economist, and I was working on kind of social good topics, but from a more kind of public sector side of things, from development agencies. And I ended up picking up this book by a woman named Anmai Chang, and she is an interesting character because she was a lead engineer for Google when they were kind of developing the step-by-step driving instructions for Google Maps, and she led that team and was a very successful young career person in Silicon Valley who then kind of had made this decision that she wanted to use her superpowers for good, and moved into the public sector, and ended up becoming the chief innovation officer for USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and started to kind of ponder this question: why are these development projects not working very effectively? But interestingly, before her time at Google, she worked in a startup, and one of the engineers on her team was a young engineer named Eric Ries. And they became friends, and they communicated over the years. And as Eric Ries was developing, under the guidance of Steve Blank, was developing the lean startup. Anyways, Anmai Chang kind of took some of these principles, and she wrote this book called Lean Impact. How to innovate for radically greater social good. And really, the book kind of pondered this question: why have so few social interventions have achieved significant impact at scale? Like, what is the missing link that kept this from happening? And rather than throw out the answer already, what do you think, Dries? Why do you think we can have gimmicky apps, or the ability to get groceries at home, or scooters that litter our sidewalks easily become these multi-billion-dollar ventures, but things that are actually hugely impactful for the world seem to be unable to do that?
Now, one of my explanations would be, and this maybe is again a bit of an academic explanation, but I would say there is a selection effect. So the question is, which founders in the end create social ventures? And like you were explaining with the example of the lady who wrote the book, so she worked at Google, I suppose she worked like crazy, and then maybe also came to the conclusion, okay, this is not what I want for the rest of my life, so I will do a social venture, but also maybe then with a different ambition set. And that ambition set in the end is also reflected in the results of these social ventures, that you might be less kind of, how do I have to say, pushing towards just making it happen despite all the other circumstances that you're facing. And that to some extent might explain that you're not then creating this kind of outliers which unicorns tend to be.
So you think you would say it's almost the motivations of the founders? Then gotcha. Interesting. I did not expect that answer.
Okay.
I mean, so for me, this is my kind of previous perspective on this was that it was the motivations of investors. Because my experience when I was raising capital for Kula was I was getting turned away before I was getting even an opportunity to pitch because they connected social good to less profits, right? And I think this whole people, planet, profits hierarchy that has become so ubiquitous, a lot of investors said, oh, profits are on the bottom and all these other things are going to take priority. So by nature, that's not going to be a good investment. And of course, as being a founder in that role myself, you're always looking for reasons external, because I can say from my burnout on that journey, there was no shortage of motivation or effort that went into it. But it's interesting what you say, right? Because I think that does trigger some interesting, I guess, things to think about. Of even if I was right and it was the investors not contributing, is your perspective something that these investors have, that, oh, this is an unmotivated founder that just wants to, it's kind of like what Frank Thelen was talking about the Bali entrepreneurs, right? Like, do they really want to change the world? The question to me is, do you have to be driven by the like solely by profit, to be a motivated, transformative founder? And I think that's, I mean, you even look at guys like Elon Musk, right? Like, obviously he's got all the money already, but I mean, right, there's no chance in any future, near-term future, that the goal of reaching Mars is profitable, right? That is a loss center without question. So
no, and actually, if you point to the example, there is now the new book about him written by Isaacson. And Isaacson was on a lot of podcasts in the prior weeks. And I think one of the things he really mentioned was that Isaacson was also so surprised then when he saw Elon Musk, that every time this kind of this purpose of making us a species that can live on multiple planets in a sustainable way, that in the end seemed to still be his driver. And again, that also Isaacson's very open about it. That also triggers a lot of dark side issues with Elon Musk. That I don't know. I don't think we can formulate an excuse for that because he has an overarching vision. I still think if you're an asshole and should be acknowledged. But at least even this guy seems to have a kind of greater purpose that really drives him to do this kind of exceptional things.
Right. Let me give you Anne Mai Cheng's answer to this topic, because interestingly, I think her response is somewhere in between, or maybe it encompasses both of our answers, in that it's both the funders and the founders that are to blame, because her argument is it's the process that fails and the systems that guide that process. So her thesis is essentially, I'll tell you a little bit in her words. She said, social change is far more complicated than building a new app. It requires more listening, more care, and more stakeholders. So the first part to think about there is, if you are a solely profit-driven business, yes, you need to understand your customers, but the metrics are very simple, right? It's revenue over cost, right? It's P&L is a pretty simple metric to look at. When you're looking at impact, you start dealing with more subjective and uncertain measures, right? So what impact means to one community or one person in that community can vary because they have different needs, and we're talking about needs-based stakeholders. She said, to make a lasting difference, solutions must be embraced by beneficiaries, address root causes, and include an engine that can accelerate growth to reach the scale of the need. Social good projects, kind of like NGOs and development work, are slaves to the cycles, the funding cycles in which they operate, right? So this requires them to have to identify the outcomes of the project before the money comes in. So if I'm a founder and I'm going to an investor, right, and I say, hey, I'm building this venture, I think this is going to be a $1 billion, €1 billion opportunity. Like, what I'm selling are pretty clear metrics, but they're also pretty, and they're going to change, they're uncertain, but the measurement itself is very clear, right? It's profit and loss. Now, if I'm a social good founder or leading a development project and I'm going to financiers for this, like I still have all of the uncertainty of what the outcomes will be, but the metrics might be wrong, right? So that creates this huge layer of uncertainty, right? So what am I measuring for? How am I defining success in a project? And if you look in the development world, like development models of, impact historically are really bad, right? What they're asking for is like how many people have been reached, how many people have been engaged. And you see these, and she talks about these examples in the book of like, bad metrics versus good metrics. And she was talking about one startup that they invested in. And initially their kind of core metric was they wanted to educate 1 million farmers on sustainable agricultural practices. The problem with a metric like that is it's super hyper focused, right? There's only one thing that you can do is you can educate 1 million farmers. So what she did was she taught them to reevaluate and shift their metrics. So they got this company to change the focus. They went through this practice of the 6 whys, essentially, of like, why? Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to do that? And they ended up reframing it to saying, we want to increase the daily income of all subsistence farmers by $1.50 a day. Right? So the outcome that they wanted to achieve was the same, but the framing of the objective was distinctly different, which enabled them the flexibility of finding different pathways there. And that's essentially the concept of lean impact, right? Is making ventures and projects open-ended and learning-based.
Okay.
So this allows for shifts and pivots within the practice and the kind of ability to design outcomes through the implementation rather than prior to it.
Because
So
you mentioned before, Gerrit, you have done your own social venture in the past, and in the end, it was not a success. So, by reading this book and reflecting back to your trajectory, what should you have done differently?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is there's probably nothing I could have done differently because the mindset of investors isn't necessarily like that.
Okay.
Right. For a social venture like I was doing, it was still, very much a for-profit venture. We still had very, very clear KPIs and metrics that we were trying to achieve from a financial perspective. But I think that the challenge here is that we have investors that are only looking at these very kind of rudimentary, simple metrics. We have entrepreneurs that are trying to optimize for those specific metrics. So there's a very kind of linear path between, profit-driven profit metrics. But when you're dealing with a social impact venture, there's other metrics at play. You just don't know what they are yet. And if you think of the concept of, customer discovery, customer development, and lean startup, it's putting the customer in the center of the journey, right? So you're always touching that customer and learning. But the social model isn't very good at allowing for that. Right. So the idea is like, can we take a more lean approach where we're putting, it's not the customer necessarily in this situation, but it's the recipient, the beneficiary of the impact, and engaging them throughout so you can define what those measures are. Now, as soon as you have to deal with private capital and things like that, it becomes inherently more complex. But to me, the interesting part of this was, here, like you said earlier, you're thinking the onus is on the entrepreneur. I'm thinking the onus is on the financier. And I think what Anne-Mai Cheng is saying is it's actually both.
Yeah, it's the interaction between these two, not? Yeah.
It's the interaction, and the innovators aren't using the right model. They're using a historically kind of linear waterfall type approach. The financiers are wanting to have clearly defined outcomes before the iterative learning cycle takes place. So inherently you have a clash of systems and methods that are preventing, the big outcomes from happening. So I think the idea is like, can we create a more open-ended model here where it's like, and you can think about it, because a lot of investors talk about, hey, we don't invest in ideas, we invest in founders, right? And if you think of early stage funding, like pre-seed stage funding, it really, at least it should be in many cases, about investing in the founders. If you took that kind of way of thinking into here, and it's like, hey, here's social innovators, we're going to invest in them, and they're going to figure out by engaging the beneficiaries what these outcomes might be. We're going to actually put the beneficiaries in the center of the process, so we should instinctively have better outcomes. Anyways, to make a long story short, I started digging in a little bit more, and what I've learned, because it's been 13 years since I did like UN work, what I realized is UNDP has an accelerator. UNICEF has an accelerator, incubator, and venture fund. The World Food Program is launching all sorts of different apps and technologies and accelerating ventures. So we're starting to see these big development agencies and organizations saying, hey, let's enable innovation in the private sector. However, we're still dealing with these same systemic issues where it seems to me on the outside looking in and just getting kind of introduced to this topic that they're still operating in that same kind of paternalistic, old way strategic, quote unquote, mindset, but without the adaptability and learning that ventures need to reach success.
Yes, very interesting. And I think the topic of social ventures is a very important one. And again, it's not something that we discuss that much. So it's very interesting.
Well, I think I would be curious to see what our audience thinks, because at least at my time at WHU, I would say a lot of the younger generation, particularly, is more aware of this and more interested in it. Sure, there's climate, but which I think is growing in its importance and visibility in the topic. But there's so many other social ventures that I think young people are more passionate about this topic than 15 years ago when I was tackling it. And I'm seeing more ventures like this as a result.
No, and we really see that at WHU, that there is also an increasing demand from the student population to focus on this kind of topics. That's, for instance, I do the obligatory entrepreneurship course in the bachelor program, where I have 300 students and we divide them in groups. So we have 50 groups working on business models in that course. And from this year, I actually kind of forced them to think about what I broadly define as a sustainability-driven startup. So they need to come up with a business model that at least in one way or another addresses a topic that is sustainability-driven. And again, broadly defined. So it can be climate, it can be inequality, it can be social issues. But that we at least kind of push them to think about that kind of issues instead of coming up with the next two-sided marketplace for a fitness studio, that kind of business models I no longer want to see in my courses, because I think like there are more important problems to solve today than that kind of issue. So let's at least try to push them to think a bit in terms of sustainability.
I think we can maybe tie a bow on this with this last message, because I think you brought up a really great point. Is I think we're in a time where competition is getting greater. Globalization means we're competing with people we'll never see, and the really great startups are the ones that are solving the hardest problems. And I think the ones that are looking for the easiest path are going to be the ones with the greatest likelihood to fail. The ones that solve big problems and can build big walled gardens around themselves are going to be, I think, have a greater probability of big success and big impact. And we need to get people thinking bigger about the problems they want to tackle. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, the onus of that goes on to people like you, Dries. And shout out to Max Eckel, who might be listening as well. But it's guys like you that can really lay that foundation. And I just wanted to, a quick narrative. I was at the University of St. Gallen in 2014 doing some work with the Startup at HSK program. And almost 10 years ago, they had an initiative called SSV for social and sustainable venturing. And they were highlighting startups and trying to promote student-led initiatives that were doing social venturing. You know, WHU has this tradition of like some really incredible, I mean, it's like Unicorn University, right? But again, it goes back to the topic of what are we measuring for, right? I think there's some really cool NGOs, Ames Foundation, things like that, that have come out of the same ecosystem, and maybe we need to start telling the story. That can maybe fall on us a little bit too, is telling the stories of entrepreneurial and innovator success that aren't just measured by P&L.
No, and I think there are now very clear also at WHU, I would say, we have the Sensibility Conference, so the student initiative focus on sustainability that is getting increasingly popular every year. Now, actually, quite recently, so sustainability has become like a top priority for WHU, even in the kind of strategic documentation. So you see, I think, positive developments there, but it will also be about having the kind of success cases that we can also use to kind of show to our students that it's possible to have a successful sustainability startup. Because sometimes I think the discussion is also a bit, okay, if we go, like you were saying, it's about the startups solving the hardest problems. Does that also mean that it becomes much more deep tech related? And if it becomes deep tech related, what is the position of WHU as a business school where we are not really training engineers, but rather business students? What can be their role in that kind of startups? And I'm not saying that they cannot have a role, but we really have to think about that. Like, okay, if we expect that the future will be sustainability-driven startups and that almost by definition will be a bit more tech-focused than e-commerce startups, what does that mean for our students and how can we prepare them to play a significant role in that kind of activities?
Yeah, and I would just say, you know, it doesn't have to be deep tech. I remember meeting a startup about a decade ago called M-Pesa, and they were one of these first companies that basically turned, in Africa, turned phone minutes into transactional currency. That's not deep technology.
No,
that is just an innovative way to look at the resources that we have. And the fact of the matter is, especially when you're dealing with base of the pyramid, type impact, you're not going to have the luxury of fast bandwidth and all the technology at your fingertips. And I think that could be it's those types of ventures that I think are great for the WHU ecosystem, right? Because you don't have to think about the future of, earth-shattering new technologies that haven't reached market yet. You can take the assets that are at your disposal and solve real world problems. So good talk.
Yes.
All right, Dries.
Yes,
something that made you think.
Yes, something that made me think. And this goes to a topic that we have discussed before, but in my opinion, this topic has become a bit silent, but I think it's still a very important topic, and that's about hybrid working. So working from home has been a lot of discussion about that when Corona finished, when people were coming back, and when we had the silent quitting movement, all these kind of things. But I think nowadays it has become a bit silent, whereas actually that's sometimes a bit the disadvantage of academic research. Today we see the most interesting papers emerging because now we have started to collect the data and we have started doing fancy analysis to actually come to some conclusions about what is the effect of working from home on the workplace. And so I brought today a paper from Nicholas Bloom and with two colleagues, Han and Liang. Nicholas Bloom is a very famous economist in the US, does very interesting stuff. And so he wrote a paper about how hybrid working from home works out. So he wants to kind of make the answer like, is it positive for companies or negative? Now, if you want to study this topic I would say in a reliable way, it's very challenging because you have a lot of issues, namely, if you go to a company and you say, look, I want to study the effect of working from home on the performance of your employees, you have quite some issues because it might, for instance, be that the people that choose to work from home are inherently different from the people that choose to not work from home. Yeah, so maybe the people that work from home, just as a kind of hypothesis, are less ambitious or have other priorities. And then they might underperform, not because they're working from home, but because they inherently have a different profile. And that's what we call in research a selection problem. So you might find a relationship, you might find a correlation, but the correlation actually just highlights a selection issue, that you have different type of people and not a real causal effect. So then the question becomes, how can you avoid that? And the typical answer that you will get from academics is, oh, you have to organize a lottery. Yeah? So you have to organize a lottery, and then randomly people can work from home or need to work in the office, which of course is a bit challenging, but to some extent, these people have been able to do this. Namely, they work together with a company that was considering, should we continue with working from home? Does it really help? And so they said, okay, let's do a research project. So in total, it was like 1,600 employees. And actually, they did quite an interesting approach. So based on your birthday, you were allowed to do hybrid working, or you needed to work in the office full time. So the people that had an odd birthday day, so 9, 7, 15, they were allowed to work hybridly. And people with an even birthday, so 6, 4, 22, whatever, they needed to work in the office full time. And of course, the great thing is, this is kind of a random distribution approach. So in that way, selection issues are avoided. And then, of course, they really monitor these employees intensively, both with surveys, but also really measuring their more kind of hardcore metrics, like how many people leave the company, what is the line of code that they write for the engineers that were involved. So in that way, they measured a lot of things to really come to a conclusion. Okay, does working from home makes people more productive? Yes or no? Any intuition there? Do you want to make a guess?
Oh, I have so many about this, right? Because I looked at, I think you know this already, but when I was doing my PhD research on entrepreneurs' peak performance, and they were in an accelerator program, the data was being collected, and then the COVID lockdown happened.
Yeah.
So everyone went from being part of this accelerator to being home. I looked at their biometric data, their heart rates, their sleep, they self-reported scales on performance and well-being. So I have my own insights on that. But the first thing that comes to mind on this topic is this research is, for me, it feels flawed.
Okay.
Because it's looking at people that work full-time in the office and people that look hybrid, but it's not looking at people that work full-time at home.
No.
And there is neuroscience will tell you, and psychology will tell you very clearly, that change has a significant impact on performance, right? So the fact that if it's hybrid, that sometimes they have to work at home and sometimes they have to go into the office, that is not very good psychologically for the worker or for the employee, because of the changing environment and the kind of readaptation that needs to take place. Now, what I can tell you from my experience and a lot of the research I did in my lit review on this topic is that there's a huge benefit to working from home, because we get to create our environment. I'm in my home office right now, and I get to create the space that works really well for me, and I am largely distraction free.
Yeah.
Now, right now, I don't have babies at home. Certainly that could, and I guess will, change in the near future, which would certainly make it harder. So there's a lot of kind of variables that can be taken into account in this situation. But I find the question limiting, because hybrid versus I feel like it's almost set up to fail. in a
Okay.
sense, right?
Interesting.
If you have to jump back and forth. And, I guess I've talked to a lot of people that are working in this kind of hybrid situation. And what I've been told by people that have been living it for quite a while, kind of post-COVID right now, is it is enjoyable when they get to dictate what the hybrid means.
Yeah.
If they have to go into the office Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but Tuesday, Thursday, they get to stay at home, and that's what's mandated for them, it creates a rigidity and change that they're not really comfortable with. On the flip side, if they get to work at home and when they feel like going to the office and then working there because they want more social interaction or they need to engage with coworkers on a certain topic, it can be very fulfilling, empowering, and productive.
Yeah. So let me then briefly explain, because that's, I think it's a good point. So what happened here was you had half of the people were allowed to do hybrid working. And what did that exactly mean? So they were allowed to work at home on Wednesdays and Fridays. And
Okay.
so the other group was not allowed to work at home. So these are the two groups that they identified. And you already point out that that's restrictive, and that's completely true. But at least you can kind of reliably compare these two groups. No? So you have the hybrid workers that can work from home on Wednesday and Friday, and the people that just have to work in the office. And so then they did all the statistics that they need to do. And so what did they find? They find actually that working from home reduced attrition rates, and meaning people leaving the company, by 35%, which is quite significant.
That's I expect, yeah.
Working from home reduced hours worked on home days, but increased it on other work days and the weekend. So what that indicates is that people working from home do not necessarily work more hours, but they kind of change the structure of when they work. So on the days that they work from home, they might actually work a bit less, but then they compensate for that at other times, which I found quite interesting.
So autonomy doesn't reduce their effort, it just shifts it to the times that make the most sense within their schedules.
So you see them adjusting. Then third, working from home employees increased individual messaging and group video call communication, even when in the office. So meaning they used much more digital tools, but not only when they were working at home, but even then also in the office, they used it more than people that were working full-time in the office. And so it seems that you start to embrace certain tools, and not only during your working from home time, but also at other points. And finally, their self-assessed productivity also slightly increased by 1.8%, which is not that much. So they actually came to the conclusion, and again, given the limitations that you actually highlighted, which I fully agree, so it's working from home, but still quite restrictive. You can only do it on 2 days that you don't use yourself. But what they were then able to establish is actually a causal effect on job retention, job satisfaction, and to some extent productivity. So even, I would say, in this kind of restrictive setting, they were still able to find a positive effect. And actually, after the results were kind of produced, this firm decided to give all their employees this opportunity to work from home for 2 days a week, because at least it tended to show that it really made a difference.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising, right? Like, I mean, stealing from Daniel Pink, right? What are the kind of 3 things that drive work satisfaction? Is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I mean, this is autonomy baked in to a certain extent. I find it interesting that they chose Wednesday and Friday because Friday would inherently be a low productivity day.
Yeah.
And you're basically dangling a 3-day weekend in front of people. So you give them the opportunity to maybe work less on the Friday, and then they make up for it on the weekend. Questionable if that's good or healthy, or how that skews the outcomes or not. But nevertheless, I think this is what much of the research that I have seen has exhibited, is that satisfaction and in the end, kind of performance and productivity tends to benefit from enabling people to work outside of the office. And I mean, in the end, just the just nature of distraction is huge, right? I mean, simple things like feeding yourself or even going to a bathroom break, right, is more effortful in those types of environments and thus take more time.
And it's nice that you point to the Friday, but because that's exactly also what made me think that they take the Friday, because I like you said, Friday is not the most productive day in companies, but I think Fridays can be a very important day in terms of social bonding, because it's maybe a day where people get a bit more relaxed, or where they even stop a bit earlier, but then they go for a drink together. And so if you give people the opportunity to work from home on a Friday, this kind of social bonding also disappears. And I think the long-term implications of that might actually be something that we have not yet studied that much. So again, this study is also a study where you look at the short-term implications in terms of how, like you said, giving people more autonomy and freedom, and the results are not that surprising. But I still think we have not yet fully understood the long-term implications, especially in terms of the social part of working from home. And especially if you do it on a Friday, I see a lot of kind of important social bonding that might be missed, and what the long-term implications can be for the culture of your company might still be open.
I'm not convinced that is always a good thing. And I recently
The Friday bonding, you mean?
Just the social bonding at work in general. Like I was recently exposed to this this story of a company that was operating remotely, and they had a retreat where all of their employees kind of came together, and a lot of them met for the first time after working remotely for a few years. And once they had the social interaction, went for drinks together. They were at a resort retreat, and it turned into there was a lot of visibility into the company's activities and actions that the employees started to learn from one another, right? And it actually turned quite negative and turned into quite a bitch fest that led to a lot of attrition to that company. And I think the question begs, like, I mean, this is maybe a bigger philosophical question, but like, do we really want our social interactions to be centered around work? And I think this is a little bit of maybe a social norm that, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's a little bit about a little bit of a control mechanism that exists, is like, let's try to make the employees' social lives part of their work as well. And that's going to drive more work and greater productivity. While I think, at least with a lot of kind of healthy people, they have social relationships outside of their work, and they would much rather spend Friday night with their family or with their friends than with their work colleagues. So, I'm not sure how efficacious that would be in the end.
But I would like to make a big distinction between the dynamic that you described, namely people working from home, and then they come together maybe 3-4 times a year in this kind of very specific setting where you're almost kind of forced to socialize. And there is a lot of pressure on talking with each other, drinking with each other. For me, that's very different from a setting where you're simply regularly in the office together, and where the socializing is much less explicit and forced than in this kind of resort settings where typically then also special events will be organized to force people to interact with each other. And so for me, these are two very different things. I also am very skeptical, and actually I see quite of some startups also in the ecosystem doing it, like we're all working away, and then sometimes we come together in a very high pressure social setting to then meet each other. And at least I would think I would really hate that, it's because then you feel so forced, and being a more introvert person, I would feel very uncomfortable with that. Whereas I like meeting my colleagues on a regular basis. So for me, I see there a big difference. But of course, that has been the discussion for a long time. companies like Google and Facebook that were kind of creating an optimal social atmosphere, but with the underlying purpose, like then people just stay at work, even on a Saturday. There, of course, we can ask ourselves a lot of ethical questions. I would agree.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, give people autonomy. You want to retain people, give them autonomy. That's my big belief. But wow, okay, we've been going for a while, and this is a good conversation today. So I'm gonna jump on and talk about something that made me think. And I think I've been taking a little bit from real world experiences this week because I've just had some really interesting ones. But about a week and a half ago, I think, as you know, I'm a CEO coach for Alchemist Accelerator, which is a B2B enterprise deep tech accelerator in Silicon Valley. And I had a session with this incredible founder in so many ways. I mean, one, she was an immigrant, female, quantum physicist with a 15-month-old baby, and leading one of the most mind-blowing ventures that I've actually had a chance to really engage with. The startup's called Forecast, and they're out of Boston. And what they've done is they've married machine learning and quantum annealing to optimize logistics.
Okay.
So quantum AI, to put it in the simplest terms.
Yeah.
And I'm having this conversation and I'm just mind blown by what I'm hearing. And frankly, I'm not so mind blown that, oh, okay, machine learning and quantum, but how actually easy it is. I was like, isn't this expensive? She's like, we're using 4 different quantum machines in the cloud. In the end, it's not that much more expensive than AWS. And I'm like, holy crap, the future is here. What is happening, right? So I immediately, I think we've even talked on this podcast before about wait till quantum and AI marry, what's going to happen. So here it is, on my screen and conversation. So I wanted to do a little bit of research, or at least a little bit of reading, to kind of understand, this strange but otherworldly marriage of AI and quantum. So maybe I'll just start by kind of with a quick explanation. I think most of the people understand that, machine learning, it's this subset of AI that kind of enables our computers to learn from data and improve performance over time. Quantum computing might be a little bit more obscure for people and just heard the buzzword term, but this is basically a new computing technology based on principles of quantum mechanics to process information. So in traditional computing, we process in bits, right? These are ones and zeros to represent data. Quantum computers can basically use something called qubits, right? So it's instead of just having ones and zeros, it can have combinations of the two. So it can have 1 0 0 1 1 1 0 0. So essentially, these bits can exist in multiple states at the same time. Hence the concept of quantum. But what this does, it allows for just much more complex calculations and at unprecedented speeds. The crazy part is with each qubit added, that's another exponential multiplier of processing power and speed. So holy shit, that's some serious horsepower. And we have barely scratched the surface of this. But we already have a bunch of startups that are writing code for this type of processing. By the way, you'd be interested to know that it's all in Python.
Yeah.
So I was surprised to hear that as well. So what does this mean for the world, the marriage of the two? So first, I can tell you it was pretty. Hopefully, I'm not sharing any trade secrets about this awesome company, but they just ran their first pilot, and they ran it with 4 Walmarts and just 4 stores to optimize the last mile. And with each of those 4 stores just running this technology, they saved each store $20K a month.
Oh.
So 4 stores, they saved $80K a month on last mile only. So imagine the optimization, 30 to 40% increase in efficiency just on last mile alone, just because they have the computing power to do it. That's a pretty big deal. That's a pretty damn awesome pilot project as well. But let's scale this up a little bit, and let's think about what this horsepower of these two things does. So I started reading some articles to see, and it actually turned out to be kind of frightening. We've talked about AI eating the world. AI and quantum together really does some crazy stuff. One, cryptography as we know it, virtually obsolete. For example, this will break the blockchain. Like, one of our most transformative technologies that we have created to date, that the whole world has been so excited about, this immutable ledger, arguably just be broken.
And your 16-number password is also
nothing. Seconds, right? This could make adversarial attacks literally indefensible. If you apply it to kind of our machine learning algorithms, like, imagine the problems we have with machine learning, the biases, how they could be exponentially reinforced. Interestingly, there's error rates and stuff that can be magnified in huge ways as well. We're just taking you take that crazy horsepower, and any weakness you have in the system could be exacerbated to scales that we've never imagined. And I mean, in the end, I think the biggest fear is that there's so many unintended consequences for this that we can't even predict, because we do not have the capacity to understand the processing power that we've got. So, Dries, I think we've touched on a topic similar to this before, but this is a little bit different of an angle. I want to ask you, because you're, I think, really doing some incredible work on this topic of AI in general. But since we've done such a shitty job regulating and managing the implications of AI and creating this kind of open-ended world where we don't know what the fuck is going to happen next, have we learned anything from this experience so far that may help prepare us to manage the future of quantum AI? Like, what can we take away from these past couple years and apply to a context where the situation is exponentially more risky?
I think, but at least I'm increasingly worried about also in the current environment is the kind of the concentration of it. That we see actually that it's a very limited number of companies that are in charge of this whole LLM development, and it's mainly the big tech companies that are making the difference. And of course, and it's a bit the same companies working on quantum. So for me, a fundamental question is becoming, how can we kind of fight this concentration? So how can we make sure that this kind of technologies are not at the helms of a very limited number of actors that can actually decide who gets the technology, for what it's used, and for what it's not used? And I think regulation should focus on. That's like, and again, it's almost like market competition, monopoly legislation. What can we expect? If you see that last week Anthropic got Amazon as their core kind of investor, where you now clearly see how the ecosystems are starting competing. You have the OpenAI, Microsoft ecosystem, you will have the Amazon Anthropic one, Google, Meta. I think that is very worrisome, and I think it really limits the power of startups to contribute. I'm actually very skeptical about all these startups working on AI nowadays. I really struggle to see how they will be competitive with this kind of companies. And so the evolution that you describe, it's just the next step, and it's kind of an exponential next step. And there is a significant risk that it will be, again, the same players that lead that. So there is not a kind of healthy disruption of the ecosystem. No, it's a kind of reinforcement of the ecosystem that is already there. And I think that's something we should be very aware of, I would say.
I think that's a great point. This article that I read, Why Quantum Computing is Even More Dangerous Than Artificial Intelligence, it was published in Foreign Policy magazine. And what I found fascinating was, here we are, we're looking at regulating companies, but I think this is a little bit of a slick juke move, right? Where, hey, look left and you don't see what's happening on the right. And the argument in foreign policy circles, so interestingly, like the US, for example, last year moved their AI initiatives, like their AI research initiatives, from a policy perspective to directly reporting to the White House. So they've recognized the big issues here. In China, like China did something amazing with quantum recently, where they created a quantum communications network between satellites, and they were literally able to translate communications via satellite infrastructure. And so we're seeing, and that was through a Chinese university. So it's still quite a ways until commercialization. But the argument of the kind of foreign policy wonks is what you're seeing with these companies commercializing AI is nothing compared to what's happening behind the scenes, right? Like, how much later does a commercializable product come to, the world than the innovation that's happening behind the scenes? Interestingly, most people believe that the world leaders in both AI and quantum, Chinese government. And the big fear, and maybe China's kind of a little too big, but what happens when this horsepower gets in the hand of a despotic regime? Right? I mean, if North Korea can have nuclear bombs, and how long is it going to be till they can have, they can run quantum attacks on machines? They're already like stealing crypto left and right, and running, big time malware attacks all over the world. This gets in their hands, it could literally, airplanes can fall out of the sky kind of story, right? This is where the narrative gets kind of freaky.
At the same time, I think this is also nothing new. I remember I once wrote a book about DARPA, so the U.S. Ministry of Defense created this special agency to kind of create the technologies of the future. And if you looked at that book, you always saw that they kind of started experimenting with technologies 30 years before kind of they entered the public life. Like they were in the Vietnam War, they were kind of experimenting with highly sophisticated sensor technology. Then in the first Iraq War in the beginning of the 90s, they were actually already using drones, which only came of kind of parents 20 years later. And so it's not that surprising to me that I would expect that military departments, both in the US, but of course nowadays also in China, are now already really experimenting with quantum technology to see what can be do with it. Which is, of course, very scary, because if you talk about your processing power, if you think just only about scenario planning in terms of wars, what that can mean and how unpredictable wars can become, because suddenly the scenarios will be completely different than the scenarios that we normally calculate, that triggers huge issues that are very concerning, of course.
Indeed. All right. Enough doomsday. Let's get to something that made you laugh. Sorry, dude. I guess that's me. I'm maybe a bit cynical about some of this shit. But
we always have an instance in our episodes that it really becomes this doomsday point.
I mean, is that not a little bit inevitable, though? Like, I think I've used this quote before, that E.O. Wilson quote about, our very simple minds and godlike technology. I forgot the exact quote, right? Like, I mean, so much is happening so quickly, and we are so late to the game. Because I think we're almost becoming slaves to the innovation gods a little bit. Because I mean, to be fair, and I'm certainly in the midst of this, like, we are changing the world in so many incredible ways, right? What technology has done to poverty reduction is incredible. What it's doing to human lifespan and human health and quality of life is freaking incredible. So of course we're super, super excited about it. But I was watching this Big Think episode about alien life, right? And it reminded me, I took a course in university called The Search for Extraterrestrial Life. It was a legit physics astronomy course, right? And there's this, there's this famous equation called the Drake equation. It was a great astrophysicist that kind of came up with this concept. It's like, why haven't we seen extraterrestrial life? And the basic thesis of the question is that we don't believe civilizations will live long enough to even reach the eukaryotic evolutionary state, much less become sophisticated in time travel and travel across galaxies and solar systems. And there's two primary reasons behind that. One is the stability of the planet and the star in which it kind of serves its energy and resources. The others are the ability of these primitive minds to handle the technological evolution, and that the technology goes faster than the society, and as a result, you have biological weapons, nuclear weapons, and they end up essentially destroying themselves. So I think it is kind of embedded in at least the cynical society of the intelligentsia to say, hey, we're gonna fuck everything up at some point. So unfortunately, you get people like you and I in a room, like there's probably going to be some like doomsday cynicism that comes as a result of it. Okay, let's have some fun. Make me laugh, Dries, for fuck's sake.
Yeah, so the one that made me laugh this week was, and I'm sure you heard about it, that you had Lex Friedman, quite a famous podcast host, and again, variety of.
Are you going to say with Zuck in the metaverse?
Yes.
Oh my god, yeah, that was so funny.
And so I think I saw it first on LinkedIn, where they had this kind of movie where they saw that the two of them were in the metaverse. And for me, these are two of the most robotic people that you can think about. So I think it's not a coincidence that they picked Lex Friedman and Zuckerberg himself to do this, because it almost really looks like two robots talking to each other. Not because
I think
the metaverse, but because these people are robotic.
I think Lex Friedman even said something. He's like, I think I need to really work on my emotional expression outside of the metaverse as well, because he was just like, incredibly realistic looking avatar, but he's so serious and so like, the guy's a scientist and a mathematician, and he's not very, and he always wears like black. I was actually impressed he wasn't in a black suit. So I guess he was trying to, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
But so for me, it was almost like, I think, I don't know if you know the series Silicon Valley, that was a kind of persiflage on the whole. And this could have perfectly fitted in one of these episodes, I would say, that you have the kind of the guru of one company going into the metaverse with this podcast star, and then have this strange conversation that I think is quite far from what normal people would see as human interaction. So it felt so detached from normal reality that you have to feel like, do these guys really know what normal life is about? Or is it so different? And I think second, but that was very close, was the CEO with the interview at Code with the CEO of Twitter, Yacarino. that for me was even worse than a parody in a Silicon Valley series. It was like, how is this possible? What is happening here? I think this was the craziest CEO interview that I've ever seen, to be honest. This didn't make any sense to me. It was crazy.
That's saying a lot, because I'm pretty sure you've probably seen Elon Musk on Joe Rogan, which was one of the most unhinged ones I've ever seen. But
but there was substance involved and stuff like that. So then it becomes a different story. But this was Code is a very serious conference where the biggest CEOs come, and then this was kind of such a strange interview where she was behaving so extremely weird that you were thinking like, my God, because I think for a lot of people it was also the first time that they saw kind of the CEO of Twitter, and then, or X nowadays, and then that she was behaving like that was completely weird.
Yeah, there is something, I don't want to go doomsday again, but there's something a little bit frightening that, the people that really have arguably some of the greatest influence on society and the way the world operates today live in such a crazy fucking bubble, right? Like, they are living in an otherworldly place. And I don't mean Silicon Valley. I think the bubble of people they kind of interact with. Like, I was talking with actually one of our former guests and good friend Oliver Aust this weekend, and we were talking about, we both used to love listening to the All In podcast.
Yeah.
And neither one of us can stand it anymore because you have these, 4 Silicon Valley tech bros that are no longer talking about interesting tech, and they're talking about politics. And like, I don't want to hear David Sachs's fucking opinion on Ukraine. He sounds like he's unhinged. He's a wingnut. Like, conspiracies, like maddening kind of perspectives. And you can just tell that there's like a complete disconnect with the world and with normal people in the world. And that is my big fear, is that we are having such a kind of aggregation and centralization of wealth and capital and technology in this little bubble that lacks interaction with the rest of the world, that we're getting these, business leaders just doing irrational things, like the Elon Musk quote yesterday, right? Like, what on earth makes these guys think that they are, thought leaders and qualified experts on topics that they have zero interaction with, other than what they're listening to on podcasts or reading in the news?
No, the all-in is a very interesting phenomenon. And to be honest, I still listen to it, not because, and I feel sometimes very uncomfortable about what they're saying, but at least I think it's important that you hear how these people are thinking, how crazy it is, because they have an impact, they have an influence. And to some extent, it also makes me better understand how the politics in the US is evolving nowadays, because if even these people have this kind of thoughts and are so kind of influenced by particular opinions, then you can think, but do kind of normal people think, and it doesn't make me optimistic, but at least it helps me to understand a bit more what is happening there. And if you look at the Republican debates, if you look at it without that kind of context, it's a shit show. But then if you listen to these guys, at least you can understand what is happening there, which doesn't make it better, but yeah, at least you understand a bit more, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, it's to me, there's this strange, especially in the US, it's like, is the horse pulling the cart, or is the cart pulling the horse? Right? Like, are politics like representing the people, or are they, framing the people's mindset? And I mean, it's just, in a lot of ways, it's just as bad here in Europe, at least in the EU in general. Like, what a shift we're kind of seeing right now. And it does make you kind of ponder, like, is it these talking heads with these massive egos that are, because of our simplistic brains and media, are they the ones driving, the individuals, the societal values, or the societal values informing what the politicians say? So, all right, before we get to get into another bad road, I'm gonna switch gears, and I'm gonna talk about AI again, but not artificial intelligence, artificial intimacy.
Okay.
How generative AI can now create your dream girlfriend. So there is a growing trend of AI girlfriend technology. One of the leaders in this space is, interestingly, a Romanian-based startup called DreamGF. There are many, many others, but they're one of note. It allows users to design and then attempt to form relationships with girlfriends that they create the images and personalities of through generative AI. So you can go to these sites, you can create your girlfriend, you can define her physical attributes, her hair length, ethnicity, age.
And you also do
boyfriends,
or is it only girlfriends?
Interestingly, Romanian GF is coming up with a boyfriend version.
Okay.
But it's not out yet. But yeah, even her breast size can be defined in this thing. You can even select like kind of really focused personality attributes and fetish traits. Like, I want her to be a nympho or a dominatrix or dress as a nurse. And once you've kind of manifested this avatar in your digital universe, you can then chat with her, which includes sexting. So you can ask her, you can ask your your avatar to send you nudes. So DreamGF actually uses its own LLM, since ChatGPT doesn't allow for adult content. And then it uses Stable Diffusion to create images from the avatar. And this this company charges anywhere between 10 and 100 euros a month. They recently eclipsed 100K a month in revenue. So needless to say, people are starting to use it more and more. This to me is extremely interesting, but a little bit scary because of some of the more fundamental topics that we're dealing with. So, you know, this is intended to be funny, but I wanted to put this in a,
but I don't
in
know
a
if
broad...
we'll end in an optimistic mood here.
Probably not. Maybe that's the theme of the day. Sorry, people, the world is fucked. No matter how funny it is, we're fucked. But if you think about it, right, like there's some fascinating statistics out there about young men, and to an extent young women too. But I think in this context, since we're talking about Dream GF instead of Dream BF, you know, a recent study in the U.S. said over 30% of 18 to 24-year-old men have not had sex in the past year. Another study was the top 20% of men on Tinder get 80% of the swipes from women, right? I think many of us have heard of this incel concept, right, of involuntary celibates. So we're already having a problem with people having less sex. But there are global statistics of testosterone decline, which is quite incredible to think of. We're dealing with population decline in a lot of countries, this one included. And now we're able to manifest our own relationships with AI-driven avatars that we can define our optimal partner, albeit not a human one, but that is becoming increasingly realistic. And now I don't know why people would want to do this, but it does make me wonder if the AI girlfriend is really the final nail in the coffin for the future of humanity, that we're just going to be sexting our LLM rather than the real person we met in this world.
Yeah, but Meta is doing something very similar, no? They just introduced these chatbots where you can kind of talk with a celebrity. So you can now kind of have your personal conversation with Taylor Swift. And it's less it's less of a niche product, like you would say, but and you have to think about, so you have a 15-year-old sitting in his or her room, and he or she has the choice between, do I pick up the phone and do I speak with a real person, or do I go into the Meta chat and I can pretend that I'm chatting with Taylor Swift? What is the most interesting? I fear it will be talking with Taylor Swift, and it will be so perfectly imitated that you really get the feeling that you're talking with her. And of course, you can think about how quickly with video and stuff like that, they will make it very realistic. And yeah, like you said, I think that's, if we can all create our own worlds where we can prefer with whom we talk and never feel uncomfortable, I think it's a big issue in terms of how we will develop relationships.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear the celebrity one, you know, and I mean, at least to a certain extent, that celebrity is capitalizing on their celebrity status.
Yeah.
I read an article like a week or two ago, about some like school kid, high school kid or something. I forgot what country he was in, but he was in big trouble with the law because he basically took images of his girl classmates and with AI created, you know, sexually explicit images of these girls. And the fundamental legal question is this actually like child pornography if it's you know, AI driven? But if you kind of think of it in this context, where it gets scary is not I'm having a conversation with Taylor Swift, but I'm having a sexually explicit conversation with an avatar of someone that actually exists in this world, that's not maybe a celebrity where it's clearly a fake or something like that. So
yeah, let me give maybe one more example. So my mother became 70 some weeks ago, and as a kind of birthday present, I trained an LLM to talk like my mother. So we just kind of, and so from WhatsApp, actually, we took sentences that she uses a lot, and then you can train the LLM. And so we created my kind of ChatGPT like my mother, and so it worked fantastically good. And so you can really kind of shape her character, and sentences that she uses a lot, you can instruct it that it often use it. And so it really works, and it feels like talking with your real mother. And so at her birthday, we introduced it and we had a lot of fun with it. But then you also start thinking, okay, now when my mother will die at a certain point, let's hope it still takes quite some years, but she will die. Will I feel the inclination to open up this GPT that I created to continue talking with her if I need advice, or if I want to talk with my mother? And yeah, how should I feel about that? Because you're actually not talking with your mother, you're talking with a trained LLM based on text from your mother. But how do we feel about that? And would that help me in processing when my mother dies, or does it kind of postpone the processing? So
well, we're getting into some deep philosophical shit. Are you talking with your mother or not is the big question, right?
Yeah.
Is the meat and bones actually your mother, or is it, the personality that is?
So I think we are totally unprepared for all these questions that we raise now, and they're there now. This is not about what can happen in 5 years. No, it's happening now, and we are totally unprepared to deal with all these kind of issues, which I think, yeah.
Oh, Dries, in summary, we're fucked again, aren't we? Well, folks, let this be a lesson to you. Oh, man.
We should call our podcast now Doomsday or something like that. I don't know.
Jesus. All right, we're going to challenge each other to our next inspiration session to be like all rainbows and butterflies, because this is getting funny. But anyways, as usual, Dries, lovely conversation. One of our longest yet, so I hope people will still tune in. So for those of you that have a really long commute, I'm looking at you, Max Eckel, you might actually get through this one. But as usual, Dries, always a pleasure. Thanks for bringing such insightful topics, and look forward to the next one.
Yes, me too.
All right, folks, that is it. As usual, please stay tuned for our next episode. And if you like the episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, or leave your favorite comment, or leave any comment, preferably a good one, on your favorite podcast streaming service. Bis nächstes Mal.
Bye.